un gobierno interino inexistente, entre 24.000 y 30.000 millones de dólares en cuentas líquidas en bancos por el mundo y otros activos. Se creó una comisión de supervisión entre el gobierno venezolano y la oposición y deben ir de país en país y de banco en banco para que Estados Unidos desbloquee las cuentas. Mientras tanto, Venezuela y más de 30 países en el mundo, entre ellos Rusia, siguen denunciando la política de las medidas coercitivas y legales de Washington y sus aliados como un vulgar chantaje violatorio al derecho internacional para dar golpes de estados y derrocar gobiernos. En Venezuela se mueve el tablero geopolítico nacional e internacional. Pusimos el punto en la I.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Sean todos muy bienvenidos a Vidas. Hay lugares donde el arte se unifica con el orgullo de los pueblos. Y esos lugares están llenos de colores, alegría, pasión, tradiciones, arraigo, valor y entrega.
Real Life, Fridays, only on TeleSUR.
In Uruguay, workers' unions demonstrated against the pension reform bill promoted by the government of Luis Lacalle Pou. And the presidents and heads of state of the Community of Independent States, the CIS, discussed cooperation plans for 2023, the last day of the summit. The U.S. President Joe Biden declared an emergency state in the state of New York to cope with the impact of a severe winter storm. From the headquarters of TeleSUR English in Havana, Cuba, this is From the South. I'm your anchor, Gladys Quesada, and now we begin with the news. On Monday, the Peruvian Public Prosecutor's Office raided the homes of the former Minister of Defense, Walter Ayala, who served during the government of Pedro Castillo, and of a group of national police generals investigated for alleged irregular promotions in the security forces in 2021. According to the preliminary information, the operation will be part of the investigations against the former minister and other police generals for the case of irregular promotions in the armed forces and the PNP that will have taken place during the administration of former President Castillo. The raid started in the office of the former defense minister, where the entrance had to be forced, and continued in his house, where Ayala allowed the entrance of the personnel in charge of the operation. Elements such as a laptop, documents, and a mirror copy of his personal computer were seized.
No tienen motivación, como vuelvo a repetir. Yo, como le vuelvo a decir, yo no soy ladrón, lo vuelvo a decir siempre. Yo, si fuese ladrón, hubiese robado siendo ministro de Defensa, porque yo manejaba millones y millones de soles. Y no vamos a manchar la mano, más aún si ese general por el cual se vincula es mi...
We have other topics. Femicides in Mexico remain a rampant issue. From January to October, in the state of Mexico alone, there were 120 cases of women killed because of their gender. In 2021, the country saw more than 1,000 femicides, second only to Brazil in Latin America, and on average, 10 women or girls are killed daily. Experts and advocates said the uncontrolled killings and history of femicide can be attributed to deep-rooted cultural machismo, systemic gender inequality, and latent domestic violence. Some states have tried to address the problem by creating prosecutors' offices for gender crimes. Meanwhile, the federal government has declared more than 2,000 gender violence alerts since 2015 at the request of civil society groups. The alerts obligate local, state, and federal authorities to take coordinated emergency actions in specific locations and to address biases in access to justice, prevention, and security measures. On Monday, the Secretariat of Risk Management and National Contingencies of Honduras extended the green alert for another 72 hours due to the proximity of a cold front. The weather alert remains in place in Atlántida, Colón, Cortés, Islas de la Bahía, Santa Bárbara, y Lloro regions. The weather agency said in a statement that a cold air mass was moving across the national territory and also said that the information or the formation of a surface through will affect the north and northwest of the country, with fresh winds from the north, increased cloudiness, lower temperatures, and weak to moderate and scattered precipitation. For the remaining Honduran regions, isolated showers and light drizzle are forecast, while dry weather will prevail in the country's south. In Uruguay, the Inter-Union Workers' Plenary National Workers' Convention demonstrated this Tuesday against the pension reform bill promoted by the government of Luis Lacalle Pou. The Workers' Trade Union Center is calling for a comprehensive, solidary, and dignified social reform. The proposal of the retirement bill must be voted in the Senate, where it must count on the majority votes of the parties that make up the government coalition. The protesters reject the official initiative that proposes to work more to retire, but with less income, as well as the cuts to disability pensions, surviving spouses, and other benefits indicated in such reform. On the other hand, they point out that the major reforms must be decided among all and in favor of the great majorities. Now we move on to other topics. On Tuesday, U.S. President Joe Biden declared an emergency state in the state of New York and ordered federal assistance to supplement governmental and local response efforts due to the emergency conditions resulting from a severe winter storm. The president's decree authorizes the Department of Homeland Security and Federal Emergency Management agency to coordinate all disaster relief efforts intended to alleviate the hardships and suffering caused by the emergency on the local population and to provide appropriate assistance for required emergency measures authorized under Title V of the Stafford Act to save lives and to protect property and public health and safety, as well as to lessen or avert the threat of a catastrophe in the counties of Erie and Genesee. Also in the United States, the police station of the city of Buffalo reported that several people have been arrested after looting stores in the middle of the winter storm Elliott. Police said the situation is due to the fact that most of the stores in the city have been closed since December 23rd due to weather conditions. Winter storms warnings remains in effect in New York State for the cities of Jefferson and Lewis, while a weather advisory warns residents of Erie County that for this Tuesday there are forecasts of 10 to 20 centimeters of snow. And residents of South Australian towns along the River Murray packed their belongings on Tuesday and evacuated their flooded homes amid record flooding not seen in almost a century, with state emergency service crews saying the levels could still peak for days. State Premier Peter Malinauskas said the volume of water which has been coming down the river was the highest for more than 50 years. Floodwaters have been sweeping down the Murray for weeks, with peaks for towns downstream of Renmark still expected to come. South Australian authorities issued the urgent warning for parts of the river just days before Christmas, after the River Murray's warning levels were raised to the major flood alert level. Let's take a short break, but first, remember you can follow us on our TikTok account at TeleSUR English, in which you will be able to see news in different formats, news updates, and more. Other stories coming up, stay with us.
It is our duty to reverse the damage we cause to the planet. Let's recover our natural ecosystems with actions in defense of the environment. Let's keep fighting for a greener world. Wednesdays, only on TeleSUR.
And welcome back. In Russia on Tuesday, the presidents of the countries that make up the Community of Independent States, the CIS, discussed cooperation plans for 2023 during the last day of the summit. During the informal meeting taking place in St. Petersburg, the Russian president affirmed that the CIS states are ready to cooperate for the collective good of the Eurasian region, despite the divergence. In this regard, Putin said that despite its challenges and the threats coming from abroad during 2022, the defense organizations of the community remained articulated. The Russian leader detailed that trade between Russia and the CIS members will reach more than $100 billion by the end of this year, which represents an increase of 6.6%. On Tuesday, Serb protesters in the city of Mitrovica in northern Kosovo erected new barricades, hours after Serbia said it had put its army on the highest combat alert following weeks of escalating tensions between Belgrade and Pristina. According to Serbia's defense ministry, in response to the latest events in the region and its belief that Kosovo was preparing to attack the Serbs and forcefully remove the barricades, President Aleksandar Vučić had ordered Serbia's army and police to be put on the highest alert. Since December the 10th, Serbs in northern Kosovo have erected multiple roadblocks in and around Mitrovica and exchanged fire with police after the arrest of a former Serb policeman for allegedly assaulting Serbian police officers during a previous protest. Around 50,000 Serbs live in the northern part of Albanian-majority Kosovo and refuse to recognize the Pristina government or the state, as they see Belgrade as their capital, and are backed by Serbia, from which Kosovo declared independence in 2008. Turkey's government announced the discovery of a new natural gas field in the Black Sea with a reserve of approximately 58 billion cubic meters. The Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan confirmed and informed about the discovery of an enormous deposit that will provide even more economic power to the Eurasian nation. Erdogan's announcement comes at a time when fossil fuels such as gas and oil registered historic price increases following the sanctions imposed by the West on Russia due to the armed conflict in Kiev. On December 19th, the leaders of Turkey, Azerbaijan, and Turkmenistan held a meeting where they determined a roadmap for the supply of Turkmen gas to Turkey in what seems to be an alliance regarding the energy crisis that is affecting the countries of the European Union. And the SOS Mediterranean charity said on Tuesday its Ocean Viking vessel rescued 113 people from the Mediterranean Sea off the coast of Libya. The maritime humanitarian organization said the group, which included 30 unaccompanied minors and 23 women, was attempting to cross the Mediterranean on a rubber boat. The latest operation by the charity's rescue ship started on December 18th and will continue until January. According to Italian authorities, over 100,000 people have arrived by sea in Italy in 2022 as of December 23rd, some 40,000 more than the previous year. And members of France's Kurdish community and others held a silent march to honor 3 people killed in a shooting at a Kurdish cultural center in Paris that prosecutors stated was motivated by racism. Meanwhile, Turkey summoned France's ambassador over what it called black propaganda by Kurdish activists after the shooting. On the other hand, Paris prosecutor's office said a 69-year-old Frenchman was handed preliminary charges of racially motivated murder and weapons violations over Friday's shooting. The suspect told investigators that he had wanted to kill asylum seekers or foreigners and then had planned to kill himself, and said he had a pathological hatred of non-European foreigners. And now we address other topics. On Tuesday, Prime Minister Fumio Kishida announced Japan will tighten its border controls for visitors from China starting December the 30th in response to a surge in coronavirus infections. Kishida said COVID-19 tests will be mandatory for all travelers from mainland China, including those who have been there within 7 days of arrival in Japan. Kishida also announced a cap on the number of flights between Japan and China. The Prime Minister also said the measure is to prevent the influx of the virus in Japan and not intended to stop the movement of the people. Japan has stopped requiring COVID-19 tests for visitors who had 3 vaccine doses.
Amid reports of the rapid spread of infections in mainland China, information from central and local authorities, government or private organizations are largely different. The situation makes information gathering very difficult, and there are growing concerns in Japan. Considering this situation, we decide to introduce a temporary emergency measure to visitors from China. We will introduce this as soon as possible. This will come into effect at 12 a.m. midnight on December 30th.
And we have more news coming up after a final short break, so stay with us.
We are approaching a new era. Technology trends and the massive deployment of new networks. It is just the beginning of what lies ahead in this new decade. Atomoon. Travelers of knowledge, the future is today.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Sean todos muy bienvenidos a Vidas. Hay lugares donde el arte se unifica con el orgullo de los pueblos. Y esos lugares están llenos de colores, alegría, pasión, tradiciones, arraigo, valor y entrega.
Real Life. Fridays. Only on TeleSUR.
Welcome back to From the South. On Tuesday, South Korea's President Sung Suk-yeol called for stronger air defenses and high-tech stealth drones, while the military apologized for failing to shoot down North Korean drones that crossed the border for the first time in 5 years. South Korea's military scrambled warplanes and attacked helicopters on Monday, but they failed to bring down any of the North Korean drones that flew back home or disappeared from South Korean radars. On Tuesday, the military again launched fighter jets and attacked helicopters after spotting suspicious flight paths at a frontline area. A local county office sent emergency text messages notifying residents of a new batch of North Korean drones, but the military later said it was a flock of birds. On Tuesday, the joint military exercises between China and Russia have concluded. The authorities of the two countries described the maneuvers as strategic to strengthen military cooperation and maintain peace in the region. The exercises were held as part of the annual plan of military cooperation between Moscow and Beijing. According to the authorities of the two countries, these maneuvers were successfully carried out despite bad weather conditions. Several activities were carried out in these exercises, including blockade, control, rescue, anti-submarine, and air defense practices. High commanders of the Army of the Asian Giant highlighted the importance of these drills and affirmed that they represent an example of the successful cooperation between the two nations in military matters. In Southeast Asia, mosquitoes that transmit dengue fever and other diseases have developed a mutation that gives them greater resistance to chemicals. Japanese researchers studied specimens of the Aedes aegypti mosquito in dengue endemic areas, which they exposed to chemicals intended to kill or repel them. The scientists found that those in Vietnam and Cambodia developed a greater capacity for survival. Although the mutation was only detected in these two countries, the researchers warned of its spread to other areas of Southeast Asia, which will pose a serious and unprecedented threat to the control of dengue and other diseases. The government of Iran announced the signing of a free trade agreement with the Eurasian Economic Union. The Iranian ambassador to Russia said that Tehran and the Eurasian table have concluded negotiations, so now the final document will be submitted for ratification to the parliaments of the countries that make up the agreement. In this regard, the spokesperson for the Iranian Ministry of Industry, Mining and Trade, Omid Ghalibaf, said at present Iran trades goods with the Eurasian Economic Table on the basis of a preferential trade agreement. The Iranian officials said the Eurasian bloc granted preferential tariff concessions for at least 500 Iranian products, while Tehran granted the same regime to some 400 products coming from the Union. And authorities update death toll in tanker explosion near Johannesburg, South Africa. Initially, the authorities reported 10 deaths, which were later increased to 15 in an update of the figures on Sunday, while on Monday, another 3 deaths were added for a total of 18. It was learned that part of the victims worked at the Tambo Memorial Hospital, where 37 other people were also seriously injured. The magnitude of the explosion caused considerable material damage in a radius of 500 meters, and according to the report, the truck was loaded with 60,000 liters of LPG gas, which conditioned the incident. And we have come to the end of this news brief. But remember, you can find this and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. And also, if you feel so inclined, please join us on social media for all the latest news. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Telegram, and TikTok. For TeleSUR English, I'm your anchor, Gladys Quesada. Thank you for watching.
El mundo se mueve constantemente y todos los días se generan nuevos sucesos. Se mueve la geopolítica mundial. Nos preguntamos qué hay detrás de cada acontecimiento, cuáles son las consecuencias y cómo nos afectan. Ante estas preguntas, buscaremos poner el punto en la i.
unfolds. People struggle to make ends meet. Look around, what you see, the hunger, the homeless, the powerless streets. On your mind, the need for change. Channel your pain and your rage. Stand up and link your arms for strength. Shout it out to the police state. I can't breathe, that's why I take a knee. Won't take you for slavery. Oh, say, can you see Rome is burning? Oh, how it burns. Oh, I feel the burn. Oh, how it burns. Oh, I feel the burn. Make no mistake, racism starts with the state. to divide and rule the working class, to keep us broken, not building anew. Lessons of history revealed, organize or be displaced. The rulers have no solutions, only violence, wars and jails. Stick together and fight for your just claims. Workers united will prevail. Oh, say, can't you see Rome is over? Oh, build the new. 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 Oh, build the new.
We are approaching a new era. Technology trends and the massive deployment of new networks. It is just the beginning of what lies ahead in this new decade. Atomoon. Travelers of knowledge, the future is today.
In a world that doesn't stop, we give you space to keep up to date. Take a moment, breathe, and take care of your physical and mental health. Balance your well-being and guide your body. Only on TeleSUR.
Last year, an estimated 64,000 people died from overdosing on drugs in America. That's more American deaths than the entire Vietnam War. About 80% of those deaths came from natural or synthetic opioids, a class of drugs that includes legal prescription painkillers such as Oxycontin and Vicodin, as well as morphine and heroin. Today, 91 people die from an opioid overdose every single day in America, and addiction rates have skyrocketed by 493% over the course of the last 6 years. But this epidemic didn't just occur out of nowhere. So today we'll be taking a look at the primary culprits behind one of the biggest public health crises in American history. I'm joined now by Mike Papantonio, a founding partner of the firm Levin Papantonio, which is representing 4 Ohio counties that are fighting several pharmaceutical companies for their role in manufacturing the crisis. Mike, thank you so much for joining me. So let's start from the beginning. How did drug companies like Purdue and Janssen plant the seeds for the epidemic we see today?
The first thing they did is they went out and hired biostitutes all over the country. And biostitutes is a legal term. And we use it in the industry to talk about the scientists and the doctors who sometimes work for university, maybe Yale, Princeton, Harvard. And they go to these doctors and they convince them that they should write phonied up literature for the company. And the literature should reflect whatever the wishes of the company is. These people are out telling doctors that, you know, we've looked at all this and the product is perfect, or you don't have to worry about long-term use of the product. It's okay. And their clinicals showed just the opposite. Their clinicals showed that a person could become addicted to an opioid within about 7 days. And so they had to start off with a big lie. And to get the big lie, they had to get into the literature, medical literature, where a doctor that maybe is coming out of medical school looks at the literature and he says, oh, wow, this is revolutionary. we have a drug that'll make pain go away and we don't have to worry about addiction. So that's where it started. And Purdue knew that was a completely, just an utter lie. But they also, you see, we talk about Purdue a lot, but we don't talk about the distributors who were the real drug pushers. McKesson and Cardinal and Amerisource, they all did the same thing. They kept the lie alive where it came to treating doctors.
What types of communities and markets were being targeted by these companies?
They would typically go to areas where there's despair. They had done their homework and they figured out that if somebody is out of a job or somebody is moved from the middle class to they can barely stay alive, that there's despair that follows that. They would start off in mining areas like West Virginia, industrial areas where jobs have been lost, Detroit, where jobs have been sent out of the country, and there was just a wholesale despair. So they started there, and they understood, we're going to look at where the pharmacies are, what are the big number of pharmacies, because that tells us a lot about the population, doesn't it? Where there's despair, there are physical issues. And so we can look at the number of hospitals, we can look at the number of pharmacies, and we can begin there. And we can start understanding that that's where we want to set up our shop. That's where we want to send most of our distributors. And if you look on a map all the way across the United States, every one of the areas they hit was just like that. And interestingly enough, they were looking for a Caucasian population that was going through a despair maybe that they had not experienced for decades. And all of a sudden, it's a whole new program.
Talk about West Virginia, because I think that a lot of people know West Virginia as kind of this pinnacle of the epidemic, right? The ground zero.
Yeah, I mean, West Virginia, you'd have areas where there would be a population of 3 million people, and the company, and we would find out through the number of sales that they would sell 700 million opioids in that community. Yeah, startling numbers, but that was exactly how it worked. At one point, what ended up happening, Abby, is that people believe, we want to believe that corporate America wants to do the right thing, and we sometimes forget that they're really not a person, that their sole purpose in life is to make more money. And so we want to believe that there's some human behind there that certainly wouldn't let these horrible things happen, but that just is not the case. And so if we look at this case in particular, at every turn, there was an effort by corporate America to actually buy in to the addiction issue. Here's what I mean. When a company is selling that many pills, right? And we have, let's take McKesson. Let's say McKesson or Amerisource. They have 3 or 4 salesmen that live on 3rd Street in Huntington, West Virginia. And then over on 18th Street, there's a pill mill, right? The pill mill's been in business for months. Well, Mary or Bob, who work for McKesson, have to drive by that pill mill every day. They see people lined up at the pill mill. They see them lined up around the pill mill and down the street from the pill mill. They have direct notice that something's not right, because under their statute, under the 1970 statute, they have a duty to report anything that looks suspicious. That's pretty suspicious. The second thing that happens is Mary and Bob, who work for these distributors, they also see the nightly news. And they see hospitals talking about, we can't keep up with the addiction problem, or we don't have enough ways to, EMTs, we're seeing people, 5, 6 a day that are dying from a drug overdose. They see that, that's tangible to them. They don't have to guess, they live there. And so at some point, you have the companies saying, gee whiz, we didn't know. How could we have known this was going to happen? Well, let's give them year 1 and year 2. Let's give them that. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt, which there's no reason to do that, but let's do it anyway. Let's give them the reason of doubt for year 1 and 2. What about year 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10? What they actually did, Abby, is they made this addiction issue part of their business plan. They internalized what was happening out there in the street to become part of their business. And so all of a sudden, you've got pills being sold out on the street for $5 to $8 a pill. Somebody's got to buy them somewhere. It's coming from the companies, and they knew that. Look, it defies logic, don't you see? It defies total logic to see something go from a company that's selling $150 million worth of products to where an industry is making $500 $500 million just in a short period of time. And they're saying, wow, that's a pretty good year. And then they're making $8 billion. And then the industry is collectively doing $100 billion. And then they're doing 200 and 300 billion. What's changed? I mean, really, it's just a logical question. What has changed?
The addiction rate.
The addiction rate. And how has that happened? Because they put the product out there.
Unbelievable.
Knowingly. Yeah.
And then it's so normalized, it only really makes the news when you have, someone like Philip Seymour Hoffman dying from a fentanyl-laced heroin dose.
Yeah, and the heroin, since you raised that, the heroin, you see, is really what we call the tail of the problem. Because what would happen, a pill mill would be crushed. Enforcement would finally be able to close down that pill mill. So availability of opioids was a big problem. In comes black tar heroin. And the drug user who used to be using OxyContin now has moved to heroin. And the industry knew that too. The industry understood we can't just addict 100,000 people in this area of the state and then leave town without knowing there's some repercussions. Understand, an opioid addict, it's not just that they want another high. It is that their body hurts. They're nauseous. They can't function. Sometimes they can't walk. They lose, as far as losing their eyesight sometimes, because they're in withdrawals from the opiate. So in comes black tar heroin. They don't buy it because they want the high. They buy it because their physical pain is so incredible that it's just like you waking up with the worst, flu times 1,000 every day.
There's many unique phenomenons to American society. I think the crisis of healthcare or lack thereof is obviously one of them. This is also, I feel like, a unique phenomenon in terms of the numbers, the sheer numbers of people dying from the opioid epidemic. Why is the U.S. So specifically impacted by this? 95,
to follow up on that very issue, 95% of all the Suboxones sold in the world are sold in the United States. They actually started telling hospitals and doctors, it's just not fair. What you're doing to these poor people, making them suffer, it just isn't fair. And actually the hospital industry got involved because they were told these same lies. So the hospital, matter of fact, the HHS, which is the biggest hospital organization in the country, send out letters to doctors in around 2005, 2006 saying, we don't think you're selling enough opioids. And the poor patient, because of that, we're suffering. It became a narrative that was created by the industry. They tried to make it sound like, oh, the poor patient, we got to worry about the poor patient. And so it sounds plausible, doesn't it? But behind there, what they were saying is, we really hope that patient buys a lot of drugs. They really didn't care about, the suffering of the patient from pain. It was all about how to sell more drugs.
Isn't there a part of willful ignorance, though, on behalf of the medical field and the hospitals and the doctors?
I guess some of it's willful. For example, if you have a pill mill, that's not willful ignorance. That's intent, where you have a doctor that says, wow, I'm making a lot of money selling these drugs. And at 8 o'clock in the morning, you go by his office and there's a circle all the way out to the street, people standing in their pajamas with their children, lined up for blocks, waiting to get into the pill mill. That's the level that it reached in the extreme.
When did the science become clear? Because of course, big pharma, we know their profit, mechanism, but the doctors, they need the doctors to prescribe these, and according to the CDC, over 99% are over-prescribing opioids.
Yeah, the story about opium has always been clear. As a matter of fact, the opium wars that took place in China, if you go back and look to that historical basis, that wasn't, it wasn't trade companies like tea trade companies that started the opium war. It was London. And how dangerous opium was. And there's no difference between the opium that they found was so dangerous, 17s, 18s, there was no difference. And it became so bad in China that the emperor in China said, my gosh, we're losing control of our culture. And he actually started having public executions. So what ended up happening is you had a lot of Chinese migrate to California. And when they got to California, what did they do? They started opening their opium dens. And so those laws developed that where doctors, that the only people that could prescribe it would be doctors under really extreme limitations, even back during the time of opium dens in California. So the history, there's so much history about how dangerous opium is. There was no new discovery. These people understood that they had a cash cow, and they knew about the value of the cash cow just by reading a history book.
And let's talk about that value. How much money is there to be made in this industry?
And say, gee, Purdue is they're the bad guy. They're awful. I mean, they're awful. But what about the people who said you have to have the drug pushers too? And the drug pushers were McKesson and Amerisource and Cardinal and many other distributors, but those three companies were able to gain 85% of the market. They took control of 85% of the market. They did that by way of legislation that we passed, that was the Substance Abuse Act in 1970. They were supposed to be the gatekeepers, you see.
But now today, obviously Big Pharma's not doing anything about it because it's their profit-making measure, but what about doctors and hospitals? Are they doing anything?
They are, yeah. You have doctors and hospitals that are now reacting, but they can't react fast enough. You see, the industry wants to blame it on law enforcement and doctors and just no good people that don't have any self-control. Let it be their child who gets hooked on OxyContin. Let them watch what happens. And you start, and then the realism hits in. I mean, you've killed a person. They're killing people. It's no different than murder. I mean, why won't we call it murder? Why won't we do that when we have a kid that maybe, was a all-star kind of kid in high school, and all of a sudden they break a leg or some type of injury, and they go to the doctor, and the next thing you know, they're hooked on these opioids, and they're